So our first question is, where did Ashkenazi Jewry begin, and where did it get its name and language?
I can answer, or at least part answer. So Ashkenazic Jewry began. I mean, that's sort of a vague thing. I mean, it started with Jewish people all over mainland Europe. So all the way England, France, all that kind of stuff. But then they got pushed to the east. So if that's what it means like all over Europe first, and then the name and language from the Bible with Ashkenaza, or forget exactly the exact pronunciation of the word, but Northern Kingdom didn't really know what it was, so they went, okay, it's Germany, and then referred to as Ashkenaza or Ashkenaz. Again, I can't remember exactly what it was.
Ashkenaz. Ashkenaz is the geographic term.
And then language from Middle German written with Hebrew letters, with, of course, some bits of Hebrew and other bits of things thrown in, similar to English, with its collection of all kinds of influences to make a lovely little quilt of a language.
Yeah.
Rabbi, is Ashkelon in Israel the same root, word root?
No.
No, okay.
No, not related. Ashkelon is actually an ancient city. There's references to that elsewhere. But no, it's not directly related. One other note I'll mention about the languages is that in Rashi's literature, Rashi actually doesn't use Yiddish because he's sort of pre-Yiddish. He's living in the Rhine Valley. This is before they really got integrated with German culture. But Rashi does occasionally make references to Old French, what he calls la'az. He'll say, this word, or as they say in la'az, blah, blah, blah. And actually, if you want to be a scholar of Old French, some people actually have to learn that Rashi alphabet to study his usage of the term, because he's one of the first people to write down that Old French language. Remember, for many centuries, the peasant language, the vernacular language, was not the written language. If you were a scholar in 900 in Europe, you wrote in Latin. And maybe you learned Greek to read some of the old manuscripts, but you didn't write in French or German. That's what the peasantry spoke. So the idea of writing down those languages is an innovation. I mean, the same happens in Eastern Europe. Ukrainian isn't written down until the 19th century. They were speaking it before, but it was the language of peasants who were illiterate, and they didn't write it down. And the people in charge didn't want to bother writing it down either. I mean, the court language in Russia was French. It wasn't even Russian. So what's fascinating is that Rashi in his time period was exposed enough to non-Jewish culture and languages that he does know something of that language, even as he's writing these very famous Hebrew works. So we'll move on to ask about Rashi, the next one. Where did Rashi live, and what made him famous, and how is he relevant to secular humanistic Jews?
Well, of course, you mentioned, I was going to say he lives in France, and you have already talked about his use of Middle French. I feel like he lived in the middle somewhere, but I can't remember exactly where.
It's in Troyes, T-R-O-Y-E-S.
Right, yeah, okay.
Just sort of, on the Rhine Valley, but on the French side.
Yeah, but in the French side, and and of course, he was famous because of his commentaries on the Torah and on the Talmud, and people thought that he said things that were very, very smart about those sorts of things, so they followed his interpretations. I'm not sure how he's relevant, so I'll leave that one.
Well, I want to put just a couple of details on the historical resonance of Rashi. He's considered authoritative for Orthodox Jews. He had a very sort of generally clear, and he drew on a lot of other sources. So he knew the body of literature that you could use without references, without Google, without, concordances and that kind of thing. So he did a good job of collecting the sources on particular topics. So much so that I was in a class once in graduate school, and we were studying the story of Lot and his daughters, where Lot and his daughters flee the city of Sodom. The city gets destroyed. They think they're the only people left on earth. And his daughters get him drunk and have sex with him and get pregnant and produce the Moabites and the Ammonites. This is a nice, bedtime story for kids coming out of the Torah, the book of Genesis. But in Rashi's commentary to that, he says, well, we all know that girls can't get pregnant the first time they have sex, but in this case, they held their pelvis in a certain way so they could get pregnant, and that's how it happened. So I mentioned this commentary to this class, just to point out, well, look what Rashi got wrong here. And one of them said, one of the people in the class who had been raised and trained at a day school, an Orthodox day school, said, oh, you must have misunderstood it. I had to be wrong because Rashi couldn't be wrong. Well, I couldn't let that go. So the next week I brought in a photocopy of that page with the Rashi script and everything. I said, look, it says very explicitly here. That's what he says. And her response was, why do you care so much? Change the subject.
Attack the messenger. That's how it works.
Right.
I was thinking, Rashi, if I remember correctly now, I read this a while ago now, but Rashi, it seems to me, lives more or less at the time of Aquinas and Saint Denis and other people that were starting to look at, in a more rationalist way, at the scriptures. And so he was analyzing things, I think. And so the relevance to us, I think, is that analysis and willing to analyze the scriptures, not just believe, but actually try to figure out more what they're saying and how they're saying it.
Right. I mean, we could do a secular commentary on the Bible for sure, and read in what we want and read out what we can see, and have that kind of a careful explanation of what the text means as an intellectual endeavor that's common to us. The content of what he presents, if he's doing a good job explaining the story, then great. Sometimes it's interjecting what he wants to be there. And I would also mention the stories about Rashi's daughters is useful for us, because the idea that he, not having sons, would train his daughters in rabbinic literature, that provides some inspiration for us today, who would do that as a matter of course, whether or not one has sons or daughters. In fact, I just read an article this past week about a yeshiva in Central Asia, where the head rabbi had no sons, so he trained his daughter, and she actually took over for him after he died and was the head of a yeshiva, and may have been one of the first sort of recognized rabbis who was a woman in Jewish culture. And this is several centuries before the first 20th century rabbis that we're aware of.
There's a tradition about Rashi that when people study Rashi, they ask, what's bothering Rashi? And the point of it is, what question is he trying to answer? It's not about his answer, it's about what question he's looking at.
Right. And this is part of the sort of Talmudic rabbinic discussion process, is what's the thought process they're going through? And that's what makes it a kind of eternal present. You'll sometimes see in the Talmud, they'll say, if I had been there, I would have said so-and-so, like imagining they were back centuries before and adding their 2 cents in, and so that kind of eternal present commentary approach, thinking, what were they trying to say? What was the issue that bothered? Why is he bothering to say something here? That's certainly still relevant for us in understanding Rashi as a source, not just what he has to say about the Bible, what he has to say about Rashi, what he has to say about the Judaism of his era. Sometimes the Talmud is an example of evidence, not of how to live your life, but of what was happening at the time. They'll say, can a Jewish man wear his tallis or his tefillin when he's walking through the red light district in town? Well, that tells you there was a red light district. The Jews knew where it was, and they could be tempted to walk through it with their tefillin on. Like, there's all kinds of sociological details you get that you wouldn't see if you're just looking at what the law is talking about here. So that's where Rashi is very valuable as a document of the time and place in which Rashi is writing and the kind of issues he's grappling with. Okay, next one. Why did Ashkenazi Jews move eastward from Western Europe and Germany?
Because they was thrown out of places.
They were pushed out by persecution, expulsion,
and also invited in some place in Poland.
Right, and in some cases they were invited eastward with an offer they couldn't refuse. Certainly, the Crusade persecution led to some Jews leaving communities. The Black Death and its persecutions led to Jews leaving. Also, sometimes there was actually competition. If a guild develops in a particular town and it wants to move into the professional territory that Jews had been occupying, well, maybe they can get an economic advantage by accusing the Jews of killing his child and making matzah out of its blood, or other ways of pushing them out. And actually, by the end of the period we're talking about, you actually had Christian moneylenders who were now able to lend money at interest because the laws had liberalized. And so now you didn't need the Jews for that niche anymore. And the Christian moneylenders were very happy to see the Jews move on and to give them the monopoly on that particular profession.
I will add that I'm pretty sure that there were probably some Christian child murderers who were delighted that it was so easy to just throw the body in the Jewish quarter and never have to worry about anyone going after you.
Yeah, well, I don't know how much forensic science was developed in that era anyways, but yes, definitely scapegoats are useful, right? To distract.
It wasn't also that they want to have the pure Christian thought that by getting rid of all the heretics, but they still had schisms within Christianity during this period as well.
Oh, sure. You know, sometimes you hate your brother more than you hate a stranger, you know, because the rivalry is over the same territory. And in fact, it's worse when you have a schismatic heresy, because they're going to lead your people astray. That's why you have to get rid of them and wipe them out and burn them at the stake. And remember, the whole Inquisition was rooting out heresy in the church. It wasn't anti-Jewish for self-admitted Jews. It was getting rid of people who were corrupting or faking or lying about their Christianity. It was also a purification attempt. So sure, I mean, look, if you have the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, you've got the 30 Years' War between the German princes who liked Luther and the German princes who were supporting the Catholic Church. Well, Jews often got in the middle. You know, they were one more example of a heretic that you could despoil and then expel. And so, you know, that conflict accelerated Jewish migration to points east. Even if they kept the German language, they weren't going to be there for much longer. So number 4 talks more about the relations of Christians with Jews during the Middle Ages. You know, Jews were kept around as a witness, oppressed, but testifying to the truth of Christianity. We had the accusations of the blood libel, the host desecration, the poisoning of wells, and so on. So let me ask you the second part of the question, which is, in what ways do you think this legacy continues to influence Jewish-Christian relations today?
I think, if I could jump in, I think that especially when you look at evangelicals, you have a very strong, you know, for example, they tend to be very pro-Israel, but why are they pro-Israel? They're pro-Israel because they think it's the beginning of the end of days, you know, part of the fulfillment of the Christian prophecy, which they take, you know, by manipulating the Hebrew Testament and creating a eschatological lineage going to the end of days, you know, with Jesus and everything. So they tend to be anti-Semitic. At the same time, they tend to be pro-Israel. It's because the Gospels talk. I mean, especially John is very anti-Semitic, and he's writing at a time of where there's a lot of anti-Semitism and a lot of anti-Jewish feeling in the time that that it's being written, that gospel is being written, not John himself, because there's no John that wrote this. But yeah, that's another issue. So there's this kind of schizophrenic thing with the Jews sort of being the precursors and Jesus as a Jew. At the same time, there's great anti-Semitism within the Gospels themselves, especially the third and the fourth one. And you also end up with this idea, but you have to have the kind of, you know, the Messiah has to come and Israel has to sort of be there, or some, you know, for the end of days to sort of happen. So you kind of have this kind of constant problem. I always thought it was very interesting that the South African Boers were very pro-Israel, but very anti-Semitic at the same time. But partially because they wanted all the Jews to leave South Africa and go to Israel. So
yeah, but you're right to bring up that point about you need to have some Jews around for Jesus to convert at the end of times.
Right.
You can't wipe them all out. You need to keep them around as not only a witness, but also ultimately to finally be converted at the end of days. That's a medieval idea too. It's not just a modern one.
Well, I'll also add that the old anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are, you know, recycled to this day, and you have at the heart of the whole QAnon thing is just a recycled blood libel of the Democrats now, which are then associated with Jewish people as well.
Well, the wrong kind of ones. The wrong.
What was that?
They're associated with the wrong kind of Jewish people.
Yes, but
Yeah.
then going ahead and killing the little children and doing satanic rituals with the blood. I mean, it's just the old blood libel recycled for the 21st century.
Right. Right.
And then Protocols of the Elders of Zion was for the previous century, which was based on the same.
Well,
old tale.
that has other complexes too. We'll talk more about that. We have a whole unit on anti-Semitism and nationalism coming up in the modern period. Look, I mean, the Catholic liturgy talked about blaming the Jews and converting the Jews in Latin for many centuries. And you have the Passion story every spring where you see the Jews, oppressing Jesus, and by God, you get mad and you want to get back at them right away. You can read actually about the history of the Passion play and how it often played into pogroms and anti-Jewish activity because of the resonance of the story. And if nothing else, the demonization of the Jew as other, as evil, as corrupt, just facilitates the othering of them in the Holocaust era as, on the stages of they're not allowed to live among us, and then ultimately they're not allowed to live. They're just a foreign body that must be removed. And until the modern period, when it got infected from Europe, the Muslim world didn't have that level of Jewish othering. The Jews were a dhimmi, they were a subordinate minority, they were a separate community, but they were not a satanic, demonic other in most Islamic countries. They were thought to be polluting in Persia, so they were more oppressed there. That begins to feel sort of demonized. But in most Muslim countries, they were part of the landscape. They had been here for centuries. They were a natural fit. Where in Christian Europe, because they were the only non-Christians, because the pagans are gone, and they're foreign, and certainly in Eastern Europe, speaking a totally different language. They're not even speaking Polish or Russian or Ukrainian, and they're following a different religion. And they're, in fact, our religion is superseded, and they're the villains in many of the stories that we tell. It simply sets up the environment for such that Jews are at risk for pogroms in the late 19th century, early 20th century, massive death during World War I, and in the aftermath in the Russian Revolution and the battles between the White Army and the Red Army, and then ultimately in the Holocaust in the 30s and 40s.
Rabbi, don't you think though that, I don't want to jump way ahead to the 20th, 19th, and 20th centuries, but I think it's much more complex than that, just to set the stage for that later discussion, because part of the problem in the Islamic world is European colonialism. And when European colonialism comes in and Jews actually participate sort of more on the European side as a rule, into professions and so forth, like becoming French citizens, for example, in Algeria, you end up where now this is not, they're not hating Jews for Jews so much as they're hating Jews as Europeans, in a sense, or European collaborators. It gets very complicated.
Yes. At the same time, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion are brought in French translation through the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
And European colonizers, and then they're translated into Arabic, and then they become disseminated. So today, you can find it in all kinds of Islamic languages. There are TV mini dramas based on the protocols that are put on Egyptian television. It has infected that world. But as I said, it's a European origin contagion. It's the Polish flu as opposed to the China flu. But it is unfortunately a problem that's global now, and still some of its roots do trace. There's certainly a departure in the Nazi racialist anti-Semitism, but there are some roots in this Christian anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. Even to the level we saw of the yellow stars, the yellow badges on the Jews to mark them as different in a very public way. Okay, the next one, what were the major institutions of Ashkenazic Jewry in Eastern Europe? What influence does this model have on modern Jewish communal organizations? So we talked about the yeshiva system with Talmud studies, rabbis being appointed by the leaders of the community. And I'll point out, by the way, that a lot of times, if you were rich and only had daughters, you'd want a scholar to marry your daughter. So you'd marry a bright rabbi and then appoint him as the rabbi in your town. Now, is he going to give a just judgment against you when you're both his father-in-law and his patron? financially? Well, maybe not. So it wasn't, again, a real democratic system. But you did have this Kehillah Jewish communal organization that organized basic schools and charities and would represent the Jewish community to the outside world. Not always for the best interest of the poor Jews, but still providing some communal services, and these voluntary associations like the Chevres. So what might be some modern equivalents in the Jewish community of this old model of the Kehillah and the kind of services that it provided?
JUF, for one thing.
Right, the Jewish United Fund, the Jewish Federation, as it's called in many cities, they provide a lot of those communal services, free loan societies, soup kitchens, those kind of things, professional training. Sometimes they also do the representation to the broader community. You might have a Jewish Community Relations Council or something like that, that will, if a minister gives an anti-Semitic sermon somewhere, they'll be the point person representing the Jewish community to go in and talk to them.
When the Nazis were demonstrating in Skokie in the late 60s, early 70s, the people who responded to that was a community group from a couple of the synagogues in Skokie that got together, and they were the ones representing the Jews of Skokie to the government to try and get it stopped.
Right. And do they have democratic representation, or was it just the machers, the movers and shakers, the heads of the
It was the machers from the boards of the various synagogues.
Right. Of course.
I'd guess that probably the existence of those I'd imagine might have had an influence on the early 20th century really like socialist labor rights Jewish movements in the United States. Just this sort of intercommunal organizing rather than relying on your actual like local government or anything. There's this sort of I guess sort of community independence might very well have influenced the comfort of really the community organizing done in the early 20th century Jewish labor movement.
Sure. The emphasis on Jewish charity, and on charity specifically for Jews, as opposed to just giving to charity in general, that continues. But there's always that ongoing debate of who speaks for the Jewish community and who counts as the Jewish community. As one example, in Boston, they had a major issue because their Jewish Community Relations Council decided that anybody who talked with or did anything jointly with an organization called Jewish Voice for Peace, which is a Jewish pro-boycott, divestment, and sanctions organization. So they're sort of an anti-Zionist, pressure Israel as hard as possible organization, but they're Jews who are doing it. The Boston Jewish community, in its official organs, said you can't have anything to do with it. And when the Boston Workmen's Circle chapter decided to issue a joint statement with the Boston chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace, the Boston Jewish Community Relations Council said, well, you can't be part of this anymore. And the funny thing was, the statement had nothing to do with Israel. It was a statement on how bad anti-Semitism is, or Charlottesville, or something like that. But the fact that they dared to do it with this group that was treif, that was not kosher from the perspective of the establishment Jewish community, meant they were beyond the pale and they had to be, disciplined or expelled even. So this issue of who speaks for the Jews, who's part of the Kehillah, that's an ongoing challenge. At one time, there was an attempt in America to organize a Kehillah in New York City with Jewish self-taxation that would provide the structure of the Kehillah that had existed in Eastern Europe. And it flopped because it was America, and who needs to pay extra taxes? Who wants to? Voluntary donations, fine. But no. And in fact, there was a major episode where they tried to put a mandatory tax on kosher meat. They figure that's going to be, a targeted thing for the Jews, that they're going to be the only ones that pay it. And so they added this extra tax to kosher meat to support the Kehillah. And there was actually a wonderful example of learning from the surrounding world. The Jewish women boycotted the stores, learning from the socialist experience of pickets and boycotts and so on. So they picketed and boycotted the kosher butchers to get that kahila tax removed, which of course undermined the kahila, but it also showed again that power of organizing and the power of women too to speak up in America. And the last example, last question rather, given the central position Jewish religious learning and practice had for Ashkenazi Jewry, what of value can secular humanistic Jews draw from this complex expression of Jewish culture? So what are some of the roots we draw from the Ashkenazi Jewish experience?
A lot of their activities were secular. They were representing the Jews in governmental issues or relationships with the government. It wasn't just strictly within the temple.
Right, right.
I think that there's a lesson for the central idea of education, of learning and studying has always been big in the Jewish community, and I think that we have a vast library of texts, and we don't have to accept the text as written necessarily in the sense of this is the religious law or whatever. But I think that it behooves us to take a look, to draw out of these texts things that make us uniquely Jewish, and what constitutes sort of Jewish life, and you take that and you keep the forms of many things without necessarily taking the supernatural parts of them, if you know what I mean. So I mean that's what I've drawn out of my studies in the last year and a half or so of what you've been talking about in sermons and things, is drawing out of these things and not just rejecting them, but rather drawing on them and taking what's useful for us. But to do that, we need to examine and be cognizant and familiar with the texts as they exist, not just the Torah, but the other writings as well.
And the historical context. I mean, this is the lived experience of many of our ancestors. How many people are doing Ancestry.com or 23andMe and trying to figure out where their families are from and which shtetl they come from? This is the lived world of Ashkenaz. And Yiddish is a language they lived it in, and sang it in, and complained about it in. So we, we're bereft, we're disinherited if we cut ourselves off from that world just because they lived a more religious lifestyle than we do, or because their values made them different.
And a number of humanistic Jews kind of define themselves as cultural Jews. And as you were saying earlier, a great deal of the culture, the Jewish culture in the United States, descends from Ashkenazi Judaism. There's a smaller, the Sephardim and Mizrahi are a fairly strong minority, a fairly small minority in American Jews. So when you're talking about living a cultural Jewish life, you're talking about living an Ashkenazi life, essentially, in the U.S.
Well, or at least you have to be literate in it. You can't not know what a bagel is if you want to think about American Jewish life. I think one of the other things to think about is that legacy of learning in the yeshiva system has been secularized for non-Orthodox Jews, and even for modern Orthodox Jews, where, the joke about here's my baby, the doctor, and here's my baby, the lawyer, the idea of Jews, not being independent until they have their master's degree and so on. That's not an ideal in the ultra-Orthodox Jewish world. They don't go to secular university. They don't go to, they don't even teach basic math and history and science in their elementary and middle schools, and which is a major issue, by the way, in terms of self-sufficiency and literacy as a citizen. But the fact that we have secularized that valuing of learning and wisdom and knowledge into secular studies, advanced degrees, academia, or professional white-collar professions, that's a sign of a secularization of that Jewish value. But the values of learning in the yeshiva was, how much can you learn of this traditional body of wisdom? And yes, there is reasoning and argument within it, but if you go too far, you're out. You can't, there are certain questions you weren't allowed to ask. And if you talk to people who've left an ultra-Orthodox life, in fact, I just did a program this weekend with someone who's himself left the Lubavitch Hasidic world and also has done a sociological study now of people who've left. Wonderful interviews with them. It's a really interesting program, which we'll post in maybe this next week's weekly email to the congregation. He said that the people in that world think that outside learning is dangerous. It's seductive. It's going to lead you astray. So they're heirs to that Ashkenazi yeshiva Yiddish culture too. They've just taken it in a different direction than we've taken it. And we're both heirs, even if we did very different things with the same inheritance. So I see a lot of value out of this Ashkenazi Jewish experience, and we can think a little bit about, what does it mean to have a kehillah or a community today when it's entirely voluntary, with no taxation, with varieties of competing kehillahs. You're not just a member of the kehillah of Deerfield. You find a community that speaks to you, and it's by ideas and it's by emotional attachment. It's a very different model of kehillah than the rabbi of the town appointed by the town to be in charge of that town. And as we'll see next time, that shift in the idea of the rabbi of the town appointed by the town versus the rabbi who emotionally moves you, to whom you feel connected, which we see as a hallmark of the modern world, actually begins with the emergence of Hasidic Judaism. And we'll talk about that more next time as the dawning of the beginning of the modern period.